requirement that they actually have a risk appetite. It just doesn't say what's in the risk appetite in words. It can just say the risk appetite is low, which is where we came in, which is useless. So I think really all we're saying is that you can have frameworks, but you need quite a long dialogue here of trying to educate the customer, and the customer trying to persuade the supplier to actually deliver exactly what they wanted in an intelligent fashion. And in fact, you can't just simply say, take away our security and we'll outsource it to you, or we'll send you some money. Security is not like that.
It's cheaper.
It would be cheaper, yeah. I mean, most of life is not like that. Outsourcing a problem to somebody else is usually not a reliable way of going forward. But it is still surprising to see how much of security is still an afterthought in contracts, still not specified correctly, and how naive the supplier is in not actually warning the customer that in fact they're buying something which turns out to be a high risk. These contracts will last for 5 years or something. The threats which were apparent at the beginning of the contract are not the threats which were apparent at the end. Once one had known about Stuxnets and flamer worms and this kind of thing, then clearly the supplier ought to have thought of some better security to start detecting them and gone back to the customer and said, this is a serious problem. Can we actually rearrange this contract? Yes, it might cost you more money, but these are the reasons why you need to go to the board, why the board needs to actually get value for money by saying, well, actually, yes, but you'll have to tell us how many of these worms you're going to catch. We have to have some criteria for success. Any heckling from the back there? No? No?
I'm hoping there are going to be some other questions first.
Any other comments? I mean, anyone think that IBM's rubbish as a result, or that you shouldn't have mentioned the Chinese government, or mentioned the war, or kind of? It's always difficult. I hope you've turned that thing off, by the way.
Oh no, the question is the most interesting bit.
Right, exactly.
I have a question about COVID. So, let's say we have a company and we are implementing, we are assessing our risks based on this framework. Who should be involved in this project? I mean, is it only work for external consultants?
You need external consultants to provide the sort of the framework for us asking the questions. For example, I'm what they call a class consultant, a CESG licensed advisor scheme consultant. CESG is part of the UK government communications headquarters, GCHQ. They have a commercial sector called CESG, and they have examinations and they license consultants like myself who are trained basically to manage the process of asking and answering questions in a kind of framework. So, if you are the Home Office or the Department for Transport or NHS or something, it is sensible to hire a class consultant. It's probably quite sensible to actually hire a consultant who's not from the supplier, in other words, an independent one. Someone who you trust and who will work with you, but who understands the complexities of the legislation, risk assessment process, the compliance regime and so on, and can put it into terms which the suppliers can understand. Because suppliers, on the whole, are good chaps and they're trying to do their best, but they speak a particular kind of security language which has to be interpreted to and fro. So yes, you need some business kind of security consultants, but you desperately need also some IT experts who can say, our system runs on Red Hat Linux, it doesn't run on Windows, we patch it to a level which is 1 year out of date because that's what our risk appetite says, and we've got enough money and staff to deploy things in a particular way. So you need some input from the CTO and the head of computer systems, as it were, to actually turn the business process into something quantifiable in terms of money. And again, they talk to the people in the supplier organisation who actually understand exactly what is going to be delivered on what platform, which framework, whether it's going to be a Cisco, 5502 switch or whatever. So you need a kind of a mixture of pure business process here, security interpreters, and people at the bottom level of the kind of the IT chain to actually turn things forward and backwards into money and risk. So, it is kind of multicultural. And I wish in some sense that we had more people like yourselves who were trained to actually do this interpretation. I went to one big pharmaceutical company not long ago. I met the chief information officer. We'd started talking about intellectual property, and the value of patents and so on to the company. And he said, don't worry, we understand security completely there. As long as it's patented, then it's secure. That's all we have to worry about. We have to make sure that the lab notebooks are up to date, that people sign off what they're inventing, and that we pay enough to the patent agents to make sure it's secure. So who looks after your research systems? Who looks after your molecular modelling systems? Who does the density functional theory calculations? Who controls what your scientists are tweeting to each other? I've just got this interesting idea for a DNA sampling and whatnot. Is any of that actually controlled? And he says, well, no, we don't deal with that because that's not intellectual property, so I'm not interested. So, the CIO's job was wrongly defined. The CSO, the Chief Security Officer, really needed to merge with the CIO in that particular company and say there are big risks here before you go into the patenting system, and you will lose intellectual property, you'll lose competitive advantage. But the company was very good in the business process around patents, and it didn't really understand much of what went on in the research group or in the IT system. And the reverse is true in other companies who are really geeky about the IT systems, but they've no idea why they're protecting them, and therefore they don't know what data's in there, who owns the data, what it's used for. And you just think, oh, we've got the biggest possible database, and by the way, it's on an exologic, distributed framework, and by the way, I can do 1,000 transactions per second. Who owns those transactions? What happens if they're wrong? Well, that's not my problem. Any other burning questions, or can we find out that it snowed outside yet? So what are you all going to be when you grow up, as it were? I've been doing the reverse for years, so it's all right. Eventually you get to do this kind of game. You stand down here and make jokes and so.
Can I throw in a sidewinder question? Yeah. And please don't be at all embarrassed to say, never even thought about that, can't answer, it's a strange one.
I'll make up something, sorry.
I suspect it. You can more or less take everything you've said, every time you've used the word risk, you've used it synonymously with threat, and indeed...
Well, I haven't told you what the algorithm is for relating.
Right. Well, if you look at the APM's guidance on risk and all that stuff, they had quite a big discussion a little while ago about can you have opportunity threats as well as threat, opportunity risks as well as threat risks. Now, applying your thinking, apart from the fact that risk management is clearly a great business opportunity for IBM, can you see any other opportunity risks that you could apply this sort of thinking to for IBM?
Your question is a fairly broad one. I mean, there are lots of opportunities for doing things in terms of the probability that your system will work in terms of performance, or alternatively that it will work when it's turned on and off and disaster recovery takes place. I haven't really addressed those kind of areas. Well, is that what you were thinking of, or more of a financial opportunity? Where else could we go with a framework like COVID, for example?
I wasn't thinking of any particular. I thought it was deliberately broad.
Well, I mean, I think the framework I'm trying to illustrate here is, in fact, probably the most valuable part of it. A structure for thinking about IT systems and controlling IT systems is essentially the same as a framework for controlling business. business and IT being essentially the same things these days. And control objectives. How many objectives do you need, and are those objectives what you might call orthogonal? So that if you change the expenditure, the investment in one particular area, does it in fact affect the other areas, or can they be discretely regulated? In other words, if you spend more money on disaster recovery, does that overlap with your confidentiality problem? And we like to try and use these frameworks now as a method of partitioning the problem into areas which are discrete. And so you can actually say to the customer, essentially, how much do you want to spend on this particular problem, and how much expertise do you want devoted to solving that particular one first? And so we are gradually coming around to the belief that the framework is in fact more important than it looks. The trouble really is we are in danger of a kind of emperor's new clothes kind of problem, that when you pull aside the framework and you say, okay, so where's the mathematics, where are the algorithms, how do you actually turn threat and asset into an actual risk, probability, or an impact? And there, of course, the whole thing dissolves